Hello, hello, hello. Oh, there we go. We've got it. Hi, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to Science Friday's live stream with our SciFri Book Club. I am Sandy, the Science Friday Education Program Manager. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited. I am joining you from Northwest New Jersey. And speaking of, I would love to know where you're joining us from. So go ahead and put that in the chat. I can see that some folks have already started to share. Make sure that you're signed into a YouTube account so that you can join us in the chat. It should be either on the right side or below this video. And let us know where you're watching from today, because we always want to know where our viewers are from. If you don't know us, we like to say that Science Friday is your one-stop shop for all things science news. We're well known for our weekly science radio show, broadcast every week on, you guessed it, Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can listen to us on your local radio station by visiting us at sciencefriday.com and clicking on the listen banner, or of course, wherever you get your favorite podcasts. But we're so much more. When you visit our page, you'll see a variety of articles, educational activities, and community experiences, just like this one, for those who love science. But today, we are talking about this month's book club pick, Dinner with King Tut by Sam Kean. In this book, Kean invites us to time travel, not by machine, but by our own five senses. Alongside a band of experimental archaeologists, he brings Tutankhamun's world and many others off the museum pedestal and into our kitchens, workshops, and imaginations. We'll dig into all of that very, very soon. Don't forget that you can keep this conversation going after the live stream in our SciFri Book Club online community space hosted on Mighty Networks. And our good friend Taylor, who is moderating, will drop that into the chat for you. So be sure to join us in that group, because folks always have lots to talk about after these live streams. Before we get started, a couple of quick reminders. Science Friday is committed to providing a welcoming and harassment-free environment for members of all ethnicities, ages, genders, gender identities, sexual orientations, physical abilities, national origins, beliefs, and any other dimension of beautiful diversity. We've created a code of conduct to help us create a safe and positive community experiences for all. And you can read it in its entirety in the community space that I just mentioned. And because we believe that providing clear expectations is a necessary part of building a respectful community, here are the basics that you need to know. Be supportive and respectful when speaking with one another or asking questions in the chat. Share generously and listen closely. You can add your thoughts or ideas about the conversation in the chat, even if they aren't strictly questions for the guest. We're going to do our best to stay on topic. We're here to discuss this month's book club pick and, dinner with King Tut, all the different cultures that we learned about in the book. So let's try and stay to those topics and not get too away from that. We reserve the right to ban anyone who engages in demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior today. I don't think that's going to be a problem, but know that it's a one strike and out. Thanks for sticking with me. With that, it is time to welcome our very special guest for today's live stream. Please join me by posting your emoji of choice in the chat to welcome him as we add our author to the stage. Hello and welcome. All right.
Hi, thanks for everyone.
So Sam Kean is a New York Times best-selling author of 7 books. He spent years collecting mercury from broken thermometers as a kid and now lives in Washington, D.C. His stories have appeared in National Geographic, the Best American Science and Nature Writing, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and Slate, among many other places. And his work has been featured on NPR's Radio Lab, Science Friday, and All Things Considered. The Bastard Brigade was a Science Friday Book of the Year, while Caesar's Last Breath was the Guardian Science Book of the Year. The Disappearing Spoon, a classic, was a runner-up for the Royal Society Book of the Year. Both The Violinist's Thumb and Dueling Neurosurgeons were nominated for Penn's Science Writing Award. That is such an impressive resume. Sam, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay. Before we dive in, I do want to remind everybody that we're looking for your questions in that chat. So make sure that at any time you can drop a question in for Sam about the book, about Sam himself, about the writing process, whatever you're curious about. But Sam, why don't you tell us a little bit about this book before we jump in?
Yeah, this book really arose because I always had a bit of a gripe with archaeology, because on the one hand, it really is the most thrilling field, I think, in science in some ways, because it addresses some really deep questions about human history, where we came from, how we spread across the globe, in some ways just who we are as a species. But whenever I would go visit an actual archaeological dig, it just looked like the most boring work I could ever imagine. It was just a bunch of people sitting around in the dirt, all sunburned, with little toothbrushes or dental picks, picking pot shards out of the ground. And it just looked so tedious to me. And so there was always this disconnect in my mind between the amazing things that archaeology addresses and the tedium of the daily work. So you can imagine my delight when I first heard about this field of experimental archaeology. And experimental archaeology is much more focused on doing things, on trying to actively recreate the past. The people involved in this, they brew Viking beer, they make mummies, they drive chariots, they play Aztec ball games, they build rickety ships, and they plunge out onto the ocean with all the verve of Indiana Jones. It's really an exciting, dynamic field. Some people call it not just experimental, but experiential archaeology, or even living archaeology. And as you said, one thing I really appreciate about the field is how sensory rich it is. You get to taste the past, you get to smell the past and hear the past, hear medieval cannons boom, or try to, shoot off a catapult or do something like that. It really brings the past in alive that, to me, traditional archaeology simply couldn't do. So that's why I wrote this book, was just that excitement about the field. And again, how it really brings the past alive in a new and fun way.
That is amazing. And I got to say, this book is like a DIY enthusiast's dream. And there's been a lot of conversation in our group about like, I wonder if I could do that. You did everything from like tanning leather with brains to tattooing someone to flinging rocks with trebuchets. What was your favorite experience from as you were researching this book?
I think my favorite experience was the catapult, the trebuchet that we got to fire. A guy out in Utah I went to visit, he built a 30-foot tall trebuchet catapult out there. And it was just a glorious warm afternoon. The mountains were in the background. And then there was a medieval catapult sitting in the middle of this field. We spent an afternoon flinging these huge garden stones around at this wooden palisade wall that he'd built 250 yards away. And just being able to see that thing in action was unbelievable. It was just incredible. It was so big and powerful and yet graceful, and it would just pop to life whenever we pulled the trigger on it. It was just a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. So that really stands out to me.
So, of course, I have to ask, what was your least favorite experience?
Yeah, a few things. The trepanation, so it's an ancient surgery where you're opening a skull, a hole in the skull, or brain tanning the deer hide that I did. Both of those stand out because I was doing them outdoors on a very warm day in the summer, and they're just very long processes. They just take a lot of time, a lot of effort. It's really sort of a war of attrition to work the brain goo into the hide or to get the hole open in the skull. And it just dragged on for hour after hour after hour. And there were flies descending on me, biting me, and the smell was getting bad. And just, it really sort of ruined the rest of my day after that. But it was educational in a way as well, in that, you can think about, oh, I bet things were hard in the past. But when you're kind of there doing it and feeling how hard it was, I think that frustration and that emotion was an important part of the learning process.
Right.
If I had just done something quickly and it had gone perfectly well and it had been a success the first time, it probably wouldn't have learned as much, and it wouldn't have been as, entertaining when I was writing about it later. But getting to go through those emotions was an important part of the learning process, I think.
And I think it speaks to the determination of some of these ancient people figuring this stuff out and the amount of work, because you couldn't just go to the Walmart and get a pair of leather shoes, right? You had to make them yourself.
Yes, you had to do everything yourself, yes.
Yeah. I think, so this book was set up a little bit differently. You had these kind of stories that you told, obviously kind of this experiential approach to it. And what I love about it, because I'm a science teacher, a lot of times people tend to think of science and engineering and technology these days as a kind of a narrow field, things like AI or like mechanical engineering and building, skyscrapers. But what struck me about this book is that you really highlighted kind of practical knowledge that people had, and that formed kind of our first STEM fields. And so I'm wondering, because it happened for me, that it changed my way of thinking. Did this exploration change the way you think about our modern approach to science?
Yeah, in that I think I had a bit of the sort of bias that you mentioned, where we think about tech as, especially nowadays, electronic things, or, maybe a few mechanical things, stuff like that. But this really did broaden my horizons about not only how I thought about technology in general, but about how clever people were back then, and all of the really great little chemistry hacks they had, or the great little practical physics knowledge that they had. Their understanding of nature and natural history was in some ways, I think, stronger than ours nowadays. They were much more in tune to those kind of things. And yeah, it really helped me appreciate how all the smart little hacks that they had to get through their life and get through their day. Anything from, the physics of putting together an atlatl, those like spear thrower things, and how it has to have a bend to it so it can fly more straight. Or the chemistry of something like tanning a deer hide, how you prepare it. You soak it ahead of time to get the hair off there, using a basic as opposed to an acidic solution to get the hair off there. All these little tiny things that I never thought about or appreciated before, but that to them were in some way second nature. They had perfected them over time.
I just want to jump into, I see a question that came up in the chat from Elizabeth, and she asked, do you think your emotions during the tanning was more 21st century than it would be for someone in the past? Like, is that something that they would feel, or is that just anyone would feel?
Right. I mean, I think they would probably have been hot and cranky and tired. I think definitely, I don't think there's a way to get around that. For me, there was always this lingering thought in my mind that, I could quit this. I could stop doing this if I wanted to. I don't need to do this. So I had a bit less of a motivation in that sense, but, the smells and the flies biting you and the hours you're sitting there in the sun, there's no real shortcut to that. So I assume people back then weren't thrilled about doing this, but again, they kind of had to do it. So I think the emotions are probably the same in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's interesting because we do think of science as being kind of sanitized. A lot of my students think that science happens just in a lab. And one of the things I loved about the book was that it brought it outside of a laboratory, and it made it very, very hands-on. I think another thing that made it really approachable, made the book really approachable, was that it doesn't just talk about science or the experimental archaeologists and their work. It makes the history really personal through the characters and the narratives that you shared in the book. And it connected the science and the history to their culture and their lives and their traditions and their religion in a really unique way. And I was kind of wondering what your motivation was for using that format, and what you think we might be able to learn from the characters that you created and those situations that you shared.
Yeah, so the book is a bit unusual in that it combines fiction with nonfiction. There are alternating sections of fiction and nonfiction. And the reason I wanted to include the fictional parts was that, again, what's fun and cool about the field is that it's very immersive. You feel like you're really hearing and tasting and smelling everything like they would have back then. And I went through a lot of these things, tanning the leather and stuff. So I got to experience that. But I thought I could go even further by including the fictional sections, because then you're really in the character's mind. So as you've seen, if you've read it, each chapter walks you through a day in the life of a person from a specific time and place, whether it's ancient Egypt or Aztec times or medieval China, wherever it is. And you wake up where they woke up, on their bed. You eat their breakfast. You just go through their day. And again, by having it being fictional sections there, you feel like you are really there. And that's something that fiction can do a little better if you're, if that character in their point of view. It's just a bit more immersive. So I was a bit nervous about it. I'd never published fiction before, but it was fun to try. And again, I think it was I think it enriched the nonfiction parts where I was doing things, because then instead of it being sort of an experiment, or you're just building something because you like the field, you're reenacting whatever, you get to see how it was integrated into their lives. So I think it helped me take it a step further.
Yeah, and there was a lot of conversation in the group about some of the spiritual aspects of that, and the places where religion and practical knowledge kind of intersected. And I thought that came up really well in some of those stories, particularly when we talk about ancient Egypt, which of course the book is kind of named for, kind of the most famous bit King Tut, of course. And you talk a lot about mummification, both in the fiction and nonfiction, as a religious practice, but also a very practical one. And so you tried it for yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did? And then I know you have a very special treat for us that you want to share.
I do, yes. Yeah, so mummification is a kind of one of the iconic things about Egypt. And I didn't know this as much going in, but we all know about human mummies. We've seen them. And there have been some archaeologists who have recreated human mummies. So I talk about that a bit more in the book. But one thing I didn't know going in was how many animal mummies the Egyptians made. Not only the wide variety of animals they made, they mummified pretty much anything they could get their hands on. Everything from like hippos to baboons to hyenas to beetles.
Wow.
Like any animal they could find, they mummified. And I didn't realize the industrial scale on which they made these mummies. There's a graveyard they found that had something like 4 million bird mummies in it.
That's amazing.
Or another one with something like 7 million dog mummies. So they were making these on a huge, huge scale. So scientists nowadays, when they want to understand mummification, they often make animal mummies. And so I decided I would try to make an animal mummy. I have it right here. And as you probably heard, it is a fish mummy. So I'm going to unwrap it right now on camera. Let everyone take a look at it. And while I'm doing this, I can explain a little bit about the process and what I did. It's a very simple process. All you need is a mineral called natron. It's a naturally forming mineral. It forms in dry wadis, dry creek beds in Egypt. Simply a mix of baking soda and salt, even parts of each. So you probably make it right now in your kitchen if you have those two things on hand. And I mixed them together and got this fish at the store, cleaned out the insides with wine as a little bit of a disinfectant like they did with mummies back then. And then I laid some of the natron down in a casserole dish and let it put the fish down. Yes, as one does. And then put the fish down and then put more natron on top. And then just let it sit there for a couple weeks. And you can start to see it emerge here. And voila.
Oh, wow.
We have
mummy.
So I'm going to get the eye up close to the camera there. The eye is really probably the most amazing part. I don't know how well it shows up there, but the eye really stayed quite well intact. And to me, the most amazing part about this with the fish mummy is that I live in Washington, D.C., and I made this fish mummy during summer. And this fish has never seen the inside of a refrigerator. And fish are not known for lasting long. In fact, kind of proverbially the other way. They're notorious about smelling quickly. And if you've been in Washington in the summer, it is very humid, very nasty here. Ripe conditions for a fish to rot. But again, this fish has never been inside a refrigerator. And all it took was some salt and baking soda to preserve this fish absolutely perfectly. So it has been sitting on my shelf for over 3 years now, perfectly well preserved. So
it looks great. I mean, like,
yeah, it looks pretty amazing. It has a very faint odor to it. I imagine it like if you took a fish and boiled it. So the odor you would get from there, but a faint version of that. So it smells just a little bit, but not much. And the texture is essentially like a jerky, sort of, I would say. Well, perfectly well preserved. So
we've got some questions coming in about this. First one is, folks want to know, why did they mummify animals? Like, what was the motivation to do this?
As far as we know, it was a religious practice. So people nowadays, they might go to a Christian church, buy a candle, a votive candle, and light it as sort of an offering. The Egyptians were doing that with animals. So you would go to a mummy shop, you would buy a mummy fish or a mummy whatever, mummy bird, and then you would bury that underground as sort of a sacrifice to a god. So it was essentially a religious practice. That's the long and the short.
Wow. And then Tavanish wants to know, does the natron hurt to handle?
No, it doesn't. It's just a mix of baking soda and salt. So I think, you look at something like this and you might imagine it might be like formaldehyde or something, more of a caustic chemical. But essentially all this is doing, the baking soda and salt, is it's drawing moisture out of the fish. So this fish was, I think, a half pound when I got it. Now it's more like a quarter pound just because it drew all the water weight out. But after that, these are perfectly safe chemicals to handle.
And how long did it take? I don't remember if you mentioned.
I'm trying to remember exactly. It was like 2 to 3 weeks or so, something like that. Maybe a little less.
Actually, not as long as I would think. I mean, honestly, that seems like a pretty efficient process.
Very efficient. And
go on. Oh, I was just going to ask, like,
for a larger animal, it would take more. Yeah. So I think the human mummy that they made took about 4 months or something, and they had to change the natron a few times because, again, it's absorbing water, so it gets a little crusty. You got to get that out of there,
right?
Stuff like that. But about 4 months for a human, maybe 2 weeks, a little less for a fish.
And then Elizabeth wants to know if that was if the fabric that you use is pure cotton, or if you could use polyester or some other fabric.
I just wrapped it. I got some, I think it's linen here. I ordered some online and wrapped it up. That was just to make it look nice and kind of protect it a little bit. But yeah, they used wrappings like that way back when, linen or something like that to wrap it up. So I was just going with something authentic-ish. But really, the important part of the mummification process is the natron and drying it out. And the bandages, protect the outside a little bit, but they're less fundamental for the drying out process.
And I know that you brought it up just a moment ago that some experiential and experimental archaeologists actually mummified a person to test that out. And it was a little controversial at the time, but we learned some really important things from it, right?
Yeah, we did. So there were a lot of questions about, for instance, how long did it take? What tools did they use? You might know that they took the inner organs out, the liver and the lungs, things like that, and they preserved them. But they only found very small slits on the torso of the mummy. So how do you get a liver out through that tiny slit? Is there something we're missing? Did they chop them up? Like, what happened there? The tools I thought was very interesting in that the people who made it, they made some authentic tools, or they had them made for them out of copper and obsidian. And they found out that the metal tools, which you might think were more advanced, they're metal as opposed to obsidian, a glassy rock, that the metal would be superior. But they found out that actually the copper didn't cut very well. So they had to go to the stone tools to get the body open. I wouldn't have thought that, but it's something that they found because they did the experiment.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, so despite the controversies, and understandable controversies, I talk about it a little bit more in the book, but yeah, I really think that the scientific value of it ended up being worth it.
Yeah, and I remember you talking about the table in the book, like understanding why these tables were so wide was all because of the natron that they needed to be able to pile on top. So
they would find these unusually wide tables, and they would think, well, the body's only this big. Like, why do we need this giant wide table? It was because it makes essentially a pyramid of natron on top of it. And they said, oh, well, that's why. So now we understand some of the details about the process, simply because the Egyptians didn't write a lot of those details down. Maybe they just passed it down back word of mouth, or maybe it was sort of a secret that they had to keep. We don't know, but we only knew some of the details ahead of time, and now we know many more because of these experiments.
So let's. Oh gosh, there are some great questions coming in. I'm trying to decide where to go first.
All right.
Let's go with. Phil has a question. Is this field as subject to changes over time as people try to do these things? Like, is there a learning curve? And he brought up the pyramid building process that I was just thinking of as you mentioned the natron. I was thinking about what we learned in your book about how sand wouldn't work, for example, as ramps.
Yeah, there is definitely changes over time in the field. The field is a bit new, so it doesn't have the long history that chemistry or archaeology itself does. But all fields change over time. I mean, they're doing physics experiments today much different than they did them even 50 years ago, more or less 100 years ago. So, like every field, it is changing. And yeah, I think there's a learning curve. You definitely have to understand something and have a deep knowledge of the culture before you can figure out what questions to ask, what things might be amenable to experiments, and yeah, to come up with the questions in the experiment. So there's certainly a learning curve, but I don't see that as too different than the learning curve you would have in any field where there's a lot of chemistry to learn, there's a lot of biology to learn, and there's a lot of archaeology to learn before you can do experimental archaeology. But again, once you get there and you're able to do this stuff, I think it really does enrich it and brings out new aspects, and it provokes new questions that traditional archaeology just hasn't been able to do as well.
Now we're going to shift to a whole different time period. Well, not that far off, but ancient Rome. So John was very impressed by Miss Roy's middle school students in Louisiana planning and building an authentic Roman road. Is experiential learning the best way to excite and inspire young students, in your opinion?
Yeah, I do think that that's another, we haven't talked about this yet. We've talked about what you can learn about the past, but there's also sort of the more public facing aspect of how to get people excited about the past. And I think that doing things like this helps you remember and learn them. If you have your body involved, you're using your hands, it just helps us remember and learn things. And it gets people excited. Like, I guarantee those students in Louisiana who built that Roman road are never going to forget that whole project that they did. And her class was just amazing. I mean, all the things that she has them do. So it was a real treat to be able to go down there and see how excited these students were. So yeah, I do think that that's an important aspect and something that can help inspire people and get them excited. And we might not all have the resources to build a giant catapult or a Roman road or something like that. But even something like making a fish mummy or making some ancient food or something like that, something simple, or knapping tools, those kind of things are fairly straightforward. And even that goes, I think, a long ways to getting people excited.
And I will let folks know, if you enjoyed Ms. Roy's the discussion of her work, we do have a great resource about using oak galls to make ink like Leonardo da Vinci on our website. And she will be sharing more information about making concrete roads for those who might want to try it at home. You brought up the experiential part of this. So I want to swing back to a reading that you have for us all about this game played by the Aztecs. And it's a fascinating game. It's not an easy one. And I thought maybe you could share.
Yes, this was one of the miserable experiences. So this involves a game. Some people have heard about this game, played by the Aztecs when the Spanish came in and conquered them. And unfortunately, the Spanish banned the game, and it was disappeared, especially around what's now Mexico City, sort of the central part of the Aztec Empire. But it held on. It was preserved in rural areas, and now it's moving back into Mexico City and other larger areas. So I went down to play this game and play the version that the Aztecs would have played. And a bit of a background to the reading here. We played on a concrete court in Mexico City, and they had this, it's a ball game, so there's a ball involved. It's, cantaloupe size, maybe a small volleyball, something like that. And it's made of rubber, solid rubber, so it bounces really well. I was surprised at how well it bounced, almost like a basketball bounces. But because there's no air bladder in the center, and it's rubber all the way through, it's very heavy. So this ball we had weighed about 12 pounds. They go up to about 15 pounds. So it's like a padded bowling ball, essentially, that you're playing this game with.
Wow.
And the important part about the game, the unusual part especially, is that after the initial serve, where you toss it, you can't touch it with your hands, and you can't touch it with your feet. You can only hit it with your hips. You have to take your hips like this. I'll stand up and take your hips like this, and you swing like that, and you hit it with your hip. My instructor said, do a Shakira. That's the thing you had in mind. Swing it like that with your hip, and it bounces off your hip. And so you're bouncing it back and forth between two teams with your hip. And when it's bouncing in the air, it's kind of fun. I enjoyed that, and I'll get to that in a moment. But The unfortunate part about the process is that, or about the game, is that because the ball's so heavy, eventually it starts rolling along the ground when it loses momentum. But even when it's rolling along the ground, you can't use your hands and you cannot use your feet. You still have to use your hip. So you drop down onto the ground on your butt, and then you swing your hip like a pinball paddle, hit it along the ground, and you have to hop back up, and they hit it back to you, and then you have to drop down again, hit it like a pinball paddle, pop up. So you have to keep popping up and down over and over, which is a lot less fun. So after I had this practice session where they taught me poorly how to do this, my form was poor. I was not, they were teaching it fine. I was doing it poorly myself. I was sort of tossed into a game that the others were playing. I think it was 3-on-3, and then 2 of us joined. And the only other thing to know about this is that one woman had brought her young daughter to play, her 11-year-old daughter. So there was a small child playing this game too. So
wow.
With that, I will start reading. Where's this at? So speaking of which, however unprepared by the practice session, I am soon thrust into the match that the others are playing. I am told to choose which team I want to join. Classic playground torment. I glance back and forth, cringing with the knowledge that whichever team I pick will likely lose. Cravenly, I select the side with the 11-year-old child, hoping that she will shoulder some of the blame for that loss. In the version of the game that we are playing, you score points by knocking the ball past your opponent's end line. I quickly realized that this version of the game, of the ball game, is really 2 sports in one, depending on whether the ball is still bouncing or not. When it is bouncing, it is a madcap combination of soccer and tennis. You're constantly trying to wrong foot your opponents by knocking the ball at strategic angles and making them scurry side to side. Finally, you punch the ball in for a score. It is fast, fun, and dynamic. Unfortunately, when the ball loses momentum and starts rolling along the ground, the game deteriorates into Wide World of Sports as presented by Dante. Again, you can only return the ball with your hip, which means throwing yourself to the ground over and over. Imagine doing 100 burpees in a row, except every time you drop, you have to hip punch a bowling ball the other direction. My form deteriorates into flailing. My thighs begin quaking from all of the up and down. My legs are soon so shot that I cannot even enjoy the aerial gameplay. The other team is also putting weird English on the ball now, spinning it like pool sharks. This throws off the timing of my Shakira hip thrusts. One time the ball slams into my shin. Another time it blasts my rib cage. When it smacks my quad once, I crumple right onto the ground. Shamefully, I spend the last half of the game hiding behind the 11-year-old child and letting her return shots that were meant for me. I have never before felt like the proverbial little league right fielder, silently begging the other team not to hit the ball my way, making irresponsible promises to God. But that is what the Aztec ball game has reduced me to. So that was another one of those sort of miserable experiences, but something I'm glad I did, because they use this as training for warriors often for the Aztecs. Right. And they would play, I played the game, maybe 80 minutes, something like that. They would play these games for days at a time sometimes, just over and over. The amount of training that they would have gotten out of this was pretty astounding. So I walked away very impressed with, again, just how tough people were back then. So it really opens your eyes.
And as those, I don't want to give any spoilers, but as those who read the book, that ball game becomes very important to one of the stories in the book near the end. Yeah, it becomes kind of a really important moment. And that kind of brings me to this question. How did you come up with the personality and emotions in your fictional parts of the book? What was that process like?
It was a combination of just figuring out what experimental things I could do. So our scientists doing this, they're making this kind of food. Okay, let me try to work that in. So with the Egypt chapter, for instance, beer and bread were very important to their culture. And I knew that there were people out there making Egyptian bread and beer. So I thought, well, I can make the main character a baker, someone who is baking bread for the workers at the pyramid. So, and I thought, okay, that'll be a good character, just because I knew it was an important role in the society, and then there were experiments of people were doing those things. So a good combination there. About the emotions, I wouldn't say that was the easier part, but that was a bit more straightforward, just because for all of these societies, these were essentially modern humans, modern cognitively, modern emotionally, they could speak languages, all these things. So to me, it was just a matter of thinking what people would have done nowadays in that situation, whether they're, falling in love with someone, or they have a conflict with someone. I think they would have reacted the same way. So that felt a little more straightforward, just because I think the emotions were probably similar to what we would experience nowadays. So that wasn't as big of a leap, I didn't think.
And that makes me think about the fact that so many of these things, like the ball game, are being kind of traditions that are being kept alive because people are still connected to those traditions. I think of the chapter on Polynesia and the sailing skills and navigation skills. I think about tattooing, because you tattooed someone.
I did tattoo someone, yes.
So from the context of keeping some of those traditions alive, do you think that experimental archaeology is important in that process, or is it not really involved in kind of the more cultural or traditional sides of that? I mean, where does the science
I think it's a very important part of the field, in that there are definitely some, credentialed archaeologists with PhDs who are doing this work, like hardcore lab geeks, or they're, collecting data, stuff like that. But there's also this really rich aspect of the field of, you have like indigenous communities or native communities, people who are either keeping traditions alive or they're trying to revive them and bring them back. And in some cases, they are the ones who, again, if they've kept them alive, they're the ones going to the archaeologists and correcting them and showing them how things were done. And that's part of the fun of the field, actually, I think, is that insights can really come from anywhere. Again, you have credentialed people in labs coming up with great things, or you have people who have just kept these traditions alive for thousands of years, and they're the ones bringing the knowledge in. So it really is fun in that you can get insight from lots and lots of places. And I think that interplay between the academics and the people who have kept them alive, the traditions alive, is a really important aspect of the field. So that was something really fun to do, was to be able to talk to there's such a wide variety of people for the book.
We had an interesting discussion about how religious practice helped pass that knowledge forward, or how, for example, in the Alaskan chapter, how song could pass that information forward. I'm just curious what your thoughts are about some of these techniques for keeping knowledge and passing it forward, especially in the context of a time when I think we're bombarded with knowledge, right? Where it's like you can look up anything. It's such a different experience.
Definitely, yeah. With the songs, for instance, I think we maybe don't think about songs as frivolous. I mean, there certainly can be very important to people, but we might see them as a bit of a luxury or something, entertainment, essentially, is the way I think we look at a lot of these things. Whereas in Alaska, as you mentioned, those songs were preserving knowledge. They were using those in their field. There was less of a, I think, disconnect between something like preserving knowledge and navigation in this case, and something like a song. Things we would never probably make a connection between nowadays were things that they were intimately related to them. So yeah, I do think that that's another thing that sort of changed my knowledge of, is how more interconnected I think certain aspects of their lives were back then.
Yeah, I guess they kind of had to rely a lot more on one another, right? On their community, and then on nature. Let's see, we've got another one from John. These days, many people believe that ancient people were primitive or ignorant, and your research often draws a different conclusion. Have humans evolved to be smarter and more capable, or not really?
I don't think fundamentally there's a cognitive difference between people, or a cognitive I think the cognitive capacity was probably the same for the past 250,000 years or whatever it's been since anatomically modern humans arose. Obviously, nowadays we have better ways of recording information. So writing is the obvious example, where we're able to build on the past in a way that they would have struggled to back then. And also things are just much more interconnected now. And there's a bigger population. So you have more people, you have more ideas coming up and more experiments going on where you can have a little breakthrough in tanning a hide or making stone tools, something like that. So I think it's more a function not of intelligence, but of population density and being able to record information and transmit information more efficiently. So I think those were really the important things to sort of the accelerating technology revolution over the past century or so, especially.
We have a question from Stacy, I think it is, who wasn't able to be with us today, but she asked, what would you like most for your readers to take with them as a result of reading your book? And does it align with the feedback you received? Have you received feedback from readers that you are surprised by or that you didn't expect to receive? It's a big question. It's a lot.
Yeah, a lot to chew on there, but I think I would most like readers to take away a deeper appreciation for the past. And again, just how clever people were back then and the abilities that they had that we take for granted. And there were some things they were better at than I think most people nowadays. The knowledge of nature, biology, practical biology. I think they would far exceed anything that most of us are able to do nowadays. So that's what I want people to take away, is understand that these were just people like us. They had the same emotions we had. They made the same stupid mistakes we did, but they also made the same clever breakthroughs that we have nowadays as well. So I really want people to see the continuity between the past and now, and to appreciate that, despite the fact that we think we have, all these advanced technologies and things, that people back then were pretty clever as well.
That's a really, really great point. We are kind of getting to the end of our time, folks. So if you have any questions, now's the time to get them in because we are almost done. Before we leave, because we are a book club, we always kind of want to know, what's your next project? What are you investigating next?
Oh, yeah. I am working on a new book about the greatest lost treasures in history. So that'll be out roughly a year from now. And I'm interpreting lost treasures pretty widely and generously there. So it'll be things like lost relics, lost cities, lost civilizations, lost art, lost languages, some actual lost treasures. So kind of a mix of different lost things, but the greatest lost treasures in history.
That sounds really exciting. And I'm sure that I will have that one on my bookshelf right next to Disappearing Spoon. And this one. So as we kind of wrap up, we've kind of gotten into what are your expectations, but or rather, what is some of the feedback you got, and what do you want readers to take away? I'm kind of curious what you think this book will do as far as experiential archaeology and the field overall of archaeology. What do you hope this will impart to those that are active in the field?
I hope it inspires some people to pursue experimental archaeology, so to become, maybe full-time experimental archaeologists. So that would be a great thing to see. I also hope that with people who go into more traditional archaeology, it can make them think about incorporating some experiments or doing a little bit more hands-on type of work where you're trying to recreate things. Because there were people I talked to who do traditional archaeology, 90 or 95% of the time, but they found that by incorporating even a little bit of experimental stuff into their work, it really enriched their work and deepened their understanding of their culture. So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing where you're either an experimental archaeologist or you're a traditional archaeologist. I think people can do both. And I think it would benefit most projects if they did a little bit of some of the experimental work. So I hope it kind of excites the new generation to go into this and to dedicate more time to it, but also makes traditional archaeologists realize that this can supplement their work and add to their work.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring up Phil's question here because it's the last one I think might be interesting. And I know, Elizabeth, I know you have great questions about mummification, and I will find some resources for you. But Phil wanted to know, speaking of experimental archaeology, are there experiments that might be interesting or useful but cannot be tested because they're illegal or maybe too controversial? Where do you see those, not possibilities, but concerns?
Boy, I mean, anytime you get into human remains or something like that, you're going to be walking on thin ice there. Even though, again, some people did do made a human mummy. So probably anything with human remains, I think, is probably going to be on thin ice. I don't know that there's much out there that would really be illegal. There were a few people I talked to, they didn't make it into the book, but I talked with an insect expert once. He's sort of the world's expert on pain caused by bug bites. And he has been deliberately bitten by those painful things that he could find around the world. He's pretty entertaining to talk to and kind of horrifying at the same time. But those experiments he was able to do those because he was doing it on himself.
Right.
As opposed to doing it on other people. So as long as you're doing it on yourself, you're the one who goes first. I think most of those experiments are probably allowed. I can't think of anything. I mean, in medicine, there are certain experiments and things you shouldn't do. I talk about that in my book, The Ice Pick Surgeon. But as far as experimental archaeology, I think as long as you're willing to go first, I think there's not many limits out there.
Well, Sam, I am so thankful that you took this time to be with us today and share your experience and share this amazing book with us. Before we go, do you have any final thoughts, any suggestions for further reading? If we want to become experimental archaeologists, where do we get started? This is kind of your moment to send us in new directions.
Well, thank you. Yeah, if people want to start, in the back of the book, there's a bibliography or works cited that have a lot of different experiments that people talk about. There's a journal out there called XArch, so Experimental Archaeology, peer-reviewed journal where they talk about different experiments that they've done, stuff like that. Or there are schools out there where they teach survivalist skills or flint knapping, brain tanning, stuff like that. So you can find them, you can go participate in these kind of things and expand your knowledge. So there's some good places to start.
That's really fascinating. I will find those links for you folks and put it in the community group, which I'm going to remind you, that is where you want to join us. You want to get over to that community group and keep this conversation going because we still have another week of talking about Dinner with King Tut. So even if you haven't finished reading it, it's a great place to join us. And what I think is really interesting is next month we're reading Why We Die, which is all about kind of the frontiers of biology, of like how humans have extended their lifespan. And Venki actually opens the book by talking about ancient Egypt and their traditions of trying to fill these pyramids with all these different riches and about mummification and everything. So it's a really nice segue, folks. Join us next month.
Nice,
yeah, for that read. I think we're going to wrap it up for today. I thank you so much for being here. I thank everybody that joined us today. Thank you so much for coming out, bringing your questions, bringing your curiosity. Sam, I'm really excited to have gotten to talk to you. I really loved the book. I really thought it was kind of going out there to do the fiction and nonfiction together, but personally, I found it incredibly engaging. And for those of you that are curious about the book, my husband is one who does not like to read nonfiction. He works in science. He doesn't want to read nonfiction at the end of the day. The fictional elements were what drew him in. And so it was one of the first books in a while we were able to both enjoy together. So thank you for doing that and taking that kind of unique approach.
Well, thank you. And thanks everyone for joining. I appreciate it.
All right. Friends, we will see you again next month for SciFri Book Club. Please be sure to join us. Please be sure to listen tomorrow to Science Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern or on our website. Take care, everyone. I really appreciate you being here, and we will see you again very soon. Go.